Administration. The Franklin Roosevelt's was the New Deal, Truman's was the Fair Deal, Eisenhower called his administration modern republicanism, and the Kennedy administration picked the term the New Frontier as the name of his administration. And President Kennedy's New Frontier basically had four objectives. One thing he wanted to do within his administration is build up the military with conventional weapons or non-nuclear weapons. He obviously wanted to pass the Russians in the race for space. He wanted to prepare and provide medical care for the elderly, maybe not the old people. And he wanted to provide government money for education. Those were the four main goals. I think one of the most interesting things about President Kennedy is the cabinet that he put together. And I'm going to kind of mention this to you a little bit. He brought in a big variety of people to balance his cabinet. He had one of the most balanced cabinets in American history. His vice president was Lyndon B. Johnson. He was a former Senate Majority Leader, very powerful man in the Senate prior to becoming vice president. He was a very popular politician from Texas, and so Kennedy needed the support of the South. That was one of the reasons he ran with Lyndon Johnson. Didn't particularly care for Lyndon Johnson, to be honest with you, but needed his support in the South. His Secretary of State was a fellow by the name of Dean Rusk. Now I have these pictures, you can go up and look. These are all the members of Kennedy's cabinet. There's Dean Rusk there. But anyway, Dean Rusk was an interesting fellow. He was really a quiet, calm Republican. He was from Georgia, and he was serving as president of the Rockefeller Foundation when Kennedy tabbed him as Secretary of State. His Secretary of Defense was Robert S. McNamara. He was a Democrat, native of California, and he was the president of Ford Motor Company during the time he was appointed as Secretary of Defense. He was named president of Ford Motor Company in 1960, so he had not served in that position very long. And he was the first non-Ford family member ever to hold the position of president of Ford Motor Company. And he didn't stay there long because he was picked in 1960, and then Kennedy tabbed him for Secretary of Defense not long after that.
That's because he had the Edsel.
Well, we talked about that in class the other day. I should go into that. Yeah, the Edsel. That's a test question tomorrow for our kids. The nightmare of 1958 to 1960 for Ford Motor Company was the Edsel. The trouble with the Edsel was it was just ahead of its time. It wasn't a bad car, but I mean it was too fancy.
Just lemon-sucking mercury.
Yeah. Well, anyway, Ford Motor Company only lost about $350 million on that car, which is I think $2.8 billion in today's revenue. Anyway, so we talked. Yeah, that's a test question for tomorrow. So you're right.
He's also the father of systems design and manipulation of statistics.
McNamara, yeah, very bright man, and he served a lot of time in the administration, then followed Johnson too and inherited the Vietnam War and the mess there. The Secretary of the Treasury chose a guy by the name of C. Douglas Dillon. He was a very wealthy New York investment banker. He was also a Republican, and he once donated $20 million to the New York Metropolitan Museum. So that was the Secretary of the Treasury. His press secretary was Pierre Salinger. You've probably heard of Pierre before. He was an associate of the Kennedy family. He was the campaign manager for Robert F. Kennedy when he ran for the presidency in 1968, but was very loyal to the family. The National Security Advisor Kennedy chose was McGeorge Bundy. He was a Kennedy loyalist. He was a former professor and dean at Harvard University, very bright man. His speechwriter, and he was a good one, was Theodore Sorensen. He was a lawyer and a writer. He served in the inner circle to President Kennedy, one of the closest men to Kennedy during the time he was president. He was an assistant during Kennedy's senatorial years, and he served as the main speechwriter and the strategist during the 1960 presidential campaign. He wrote everything for him. He had two CIA directors. He started with Allen W. Dulles, and he ended with John McCone. He fired Dulles after the Bay of Pigs, which we'll talk about tonight, because he didn't like the information that he had received from the CIA, and replaced him with John McCone. John McCone was the former deputy to the Secretary of Defense under President Truman, and so he had two individuals that ran the CIA. Then he surrounded himself with what he called special assistants to the president. One was Lawrence O'Brien. Lawrence O'Brien, his job was to communicate with members of Congress for the president during the time that the president was in office. He actually later became commissioner of the National Basketball Association, the NBA, and served in that position for quite some time. Another special assistant that Kennedy had was David Powers. He was the assistant appointments secretary. Really, you know, as far as the position goes, really didn't have much to do with that. But he was a very, very close personal friend of President Kennedy, and he ended up co-authoring a book entitled Johnny, We Hardly Knew Ye, which was memories of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and he wrote that in cooperation in 1972 with Kenneth O'Donnell. Kenneth O'Donnell was also a special assistant to the president, and he was the appointments secretary, so he was a little bit ahead of David Powers. A very, very close personal friend, more maybe of Robert Kennedy than John Kennedy. He was very good friends with John Kennedy, but he was best friends with Robert Kennedy, and as I mentioned, they co-authored a book together on the president afterwards. I do have a kind of an interesting picture I really enjoy. If you look at the top one up there, that's the dust cover, Johnny, We Hardly Knew Ye, and there are the two Powers and O'Donnell's on the right, and Powers is in the middle, and signatures of both. Lawrence O'Brien here, Theodore Sorensen, Pierre Salinger, Dean Rusk, C. Douglas Dillon, and Robert McNamara. So the key members of Kennedy's cabinet. I think I mentioned to you this before, you know, the Attorney General was Robert F. Kennedy. He had only served briefly as a lawyer in the Justice Department prior to his appointment, and Robert was the campaign manager for John Kennedy during all of his elections. And as we mentioned, I think last time, many people were very critical of the choice of Robert Kennedy because he didn't have any experience at all. And I think, didn't I not tell you last week that he said one time, I see nothing wrong with giving Robert some legal experience as Attorney General before he goes out and practices law. And we told you that President Kennedy chose his brother for three specific reasons. He knew he could always trust him, he knew he would always give him an honest answer, and he was pressured by the father. So anyway, Bobby Kennedy really remained the president's close advisor, and he was a pretty forceful Attorney General during the time he served for his brother. Another thing we'll talk about that they mentioned briefly, Doris Kearns mentioned, was the formation of the Peace Corps. That started on March 1st, 1961, when President Kennedy announced the formation of the Peace Corps, and that was set up as a temporary government agency. It was just kind of a trial. And he asked Congress to evaluate the temporary program, and if successful, make the Peace Corps a permanent program, which it still runs today. Now, the organization was established to provide two things to developing nations: humanitarian aid and education. And as I think I mentioned last week, Kennedy chose his brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, to organize and oversee the Peace Corps. And it was kind of interesting compared to what it is now. The Peace Corps, back in those days, would enlist volunteers who were mainly youths out of college, and they were paid, you know, a small living wage, and these volunteers would travel to these less advantaged countries to educate the people in three specific areas. They would educate the people of the country academically, they would educate the people in the country in health, education, and hygiene, and they would educate the people of the country on agricultural matters, teach them how to farm, etc. And by late 1963, there were 11,000 Peace Corps volunteers that were serving in 40 different countries. And so the Peace Corps proved to be a big success, and as I mentioned, still exists today. I always ask kids, you know what type of people join the Peace Corps now? Old farts like me. People that retire. Honestly, you have much, has turned to an older generation that have decided to go out and do this type of thing. That doesn't mean they don't get a few young volunteers, but it's kind of changed a little bit, and you're more into into older people that choose to go to the Peace Corps now. We'll talk about the Bay of Pigs affair. I'm not sure what you folks know about that, but the biggest concern that President Kennedy had, you could kind of hear it in his inaugural speech and in the debate, it was American morale towards the Soviet Union. And he really wanted to take some bold, quick action to help Americans regain their self-confidence with Russia, because they were beating us in the race for space. And according to President Kennedy's debate, they were beating us in education. They were putting out more scientists than we were, etc. And he wanted to kind of do something that was going to help us regain our self-confidence to compete with Russia, because people started to question that a little bit. Well, as you probably know, Cuban leader Fidel Castro had become a very strong ally with the Soviet Union. And the United States had wanted to free Cuba from Castro's control way before John Kennedy ever got into office. And in the late 1950s, the Eisenhower administration had actually initiated a plan to try to deal with Castro once and for all. And this plan that was developed by the Eisenhower administration consisted of an invasion of Cuba, not by American forces, but by Cuban army exiles, those that had been banished from Cuba, that were being trained by the CIA. So the CIA began to train these Cuban exiles, these people that had been thrown out of their country, and they were going to try to trigger an invasion of Cuba. Now the idea of an invasion of Cuba was to accomplish three things. They thought it would trigger an anti-communist attitude within Cuba because a lot of the people they felt were being treated poorly by Fidel Castro. If they could trigger an anti-communist attitude, it would lead to a revolt by the Cuban citizens that were tired of Castro's dictatorship, which would lead to the assassination of Fidel Castro. That was kind of the hope and the goals and the plan of this plan that was put together late in the Eisenhower administration. So when President Kennedy took over the presidency, it would be his decision to decide whether Eisenhower's plan would continue on or would go on the shelf. Well, the president studied Eisenhower's plan, and he interviewed and talked to the CIA, and he wanted to know exactly what the American commitment would be if they invaded Cuba with these exiles. And the CIA informed the president that they would need the following three things from his office. They would need military air cover for the exiles during the invasion of Cuba. They would need to use American troops to mop up after the invasion and the revolt to restore order back in Cuba. And then the American government would need to assist in establishing a democratic government in Cuba. So they really believed this was going to work. And Kennedy was trying to keep his hands out of it as much as he can. So really the big commitment for him at the start was the military air cover so the exiles could get on the island. That was what he was going to have to commit. Well, he studied and consulted with his advisors, and finally President Kennedy gave the CIA permission to go ahead and continue with Eisenhower's plan. So on April 17th of 1961, a force of 1,382 Cuban exiles landed on the southern coast of Cuba at an area known as the Bay of Pigs. And the entire operation turned out to be a horrible disaster for the United States and the Kennedy administration. First of all, the landing site that the CIA chose to put the exiles on the ground was too far from the mountains, and the mountains were needed to provide protection for the exiles. This revolt by the Cuban citizens that was predicted against Castro never happened. So it was kind of a disaster from the start. And to top things off, at the very last minute, President Kennedy decided not to provide the air support for those exiles. So they basically hit the beaches too far from the mountains and were just sitting ducks. Castro was there waiting for him, and it was an absolute disaster. Now, a lot of people ask, why in the world did he decide to pull out of the air cover at the last minute? And historians will tell you that Robert Kennedy, his brother, talked him out of it at the last minute. And he believed it was too big of a risk for the United States to get involved, not so much in the invasion of Cuba, but in the assassination of another country's leader. And he said to his brother, this is a bad move. You know, we can't get involved in this. So Kennedy did not provide the air cover, and it turned out to be a disaster. After the failed invasion, Kennedy was very upset with the CIA. He did not believe he was given all the information necessary for the invasion, and that's when he fired CIA Director Allen Dulles and replaced him with John McCone. The result of the Bay of Pigs disaster, that of the 1,382 Cuban Army exiles, 203 were killed and 1,179 were captured. And you'd probably rather have been killed than captured under those circumstances. So it was an absolute disaster. Well, unlike I think today, you had to give the young president some credit because he did on national television. He addressed the nation, swallowed his pride, and he took total responsibility. He did not blame the CIA, although he was not happy with them. And during his speech, he stated two things that I thought were pretty admirable. He said, you know, I am the responsible officer of the government, and I take full responsibility for what happened. And I think one of his greatest quotes he ever said, and I tell kids this a lot, is victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan. And that's true. And so he stood up and took responsibility, and then on December 29th of 1962, he sent $62 million worth of supplies and goods to Cuba in exchange for those surviving 1,179 exiles. He did not leave them in Cuba to burn or suffer. He gave $62 million worth of supplies and goods to Cuba in exchange for those exiles. Now, it's kind of an interesting coincidence. The man that was responsible for the negotiations between President Kennedy and Fidel Castro on the release of these exiles was an American lawyer by the name of James B. Donovan. He was a lawyer, a United States Navy officer, a political negotiator, and he was the guy, if you remember, and some of us are old enough to remember, he was the guy that negotiated the exchange of U-2 pilot Gary Powers in exchange for Soviet spy Rudolf Abel during that period of time. And in the late 1950s, early 1960s, Gary Powers was shot down over a spy mission over Russia. The United States didn't know he was killed, and so they denied, said it was a weather flight and all this stuff. And finally, when they figured out that Gary Powers was alive, they had to eat a little crow, and Eisenhower finally had to admit it was a spy operation and said, hey, it's okay, I'm not apologizing for that. We'll probably run some more over your country. Anyway, Powers was sentenced to hard labor in prison, and Khrushchev just simply ignored Eisenhower and waited for the new president, whoever that was going to be, to try to get this negotiated. Well, it was in 1962, after Powers had spent some time in a Soviet prison, and Soviet spy Rudolf Abel had spent some time in American prison, that James Donovan negotiated the exchange of those two, and he was also the one that negotiated this issue with Castro and Kennedy. This was not a good start to President Kennedy's administration. His first experience with foreign affairs was an absolute total disaster. So anyway, didn't start him out real well. The next thing that happened during the Kennedy administration was the Berlin Wall. In 1945, in the end of World War II, you might have heard that more than 55 million people had died and Europe lay in ruins. Russians' Red Army takes control of the city of Berlin. Cost them 200,000 men to get control of the city of Berlin. And Russia really wants Berlin as a spoil of war. They defeated Germany and they want Berlin. Well, results of the agreement that ended World War II stated that the country of Germany would be divided. You probably know this. East Germany would be under communist control from Russia, and West Germany would be non-communist under the control of the Allies, France, Great Britain, and the United States. But the most important gem in Germany was Berlin. That's what they wanted. And the thing that was so strange about that, and you probably realize this, that Berlin was located 110 miles inside East Germany. And so they took that city and divided it in half. The western part of Berlin was non-communist, and the eastern part of Berlin was communist, but yet it sat right in the middle of East Germany. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin saw West Berlin as a thorn in the flesh of the communist East Germany. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, after taking control of Russia from Stalin, viewed West Berlin as a malignant tumor in the flesh of East Germany. And it was clear that whenever Premier Khrushchev wanted to cause pain to the Western Hemisphere, he would make it appear he was attempting to gain control of the entire city of Berlin. He just loved to aggravate the Western Hemisphere by stating that. Now, this is a little off color, but this is how much he enjoyed it. Khrushchev was once stated publicly that having control of East Berlin was like being able to squeeze the testicles of the West whenever he felt like it. That's the way he felt about it. So, anyway, so whenever Khrushchev wanted to cause pain for the United States, he just squeezed Berlin and made it difficult for those people around him. Now, when President Kennedy took the oath of office, he believed it was very important to meet with Premier Khrushchev to discuss his intentions towards the city of Berlin. So in June of 1961, the two leaders met in Austria. The meeting lasted 2 days. The entire topic of discussion was the situation in Berlin. Nothing was settled between the two leaders, and after the meeting, both nations simply went home and increased their military strength. That's what happened. So during the 15 years following the end of World War II, it was estimated that approximately 3 million people from East Germany fled to West Berlin. And these numbers dwindled the population of East Germany, especially among the labor force. So in July of 1961, it was estimated that the number of East Germans infiltrated into West Berlin was 1,000 a day. And then within a month's time, it rose to 2,500 a day. And frankly, East Germany couldn't afford to lose the labor force they were losing as they fled. So on August 13th of 1961, East German police began to construct obstacles to seal off the streets and crossings into West Berlin. And these obstacles included barbed wire fencing. And they were all constructed in the East German side of Berlin, not touching any boundaries of West Berlin at all. Now, these obstacles obviously eventually became a concrete wall between East and West Berlin to prevent people from East Berlin fleeing to West Berlin. The wall was 12 feet high and 97 miles long. It encircled the entire city of West Berlin, preventing the people from East Berlin to escape the communism of East Germany. With the construction of the Berlin Wall, thousands of friends and families obviously were torn apart, and those attempting to escape were shot down by East German police stationed at the wall. However, there were many people who successfully and unsuccessfully tried to escape communism to West Berlin. A lot of historians, or a lot of people, not so much historians, but people say, well, why in the world didn't Kennedy intervene in Berlin? Why didn't he step up and keep the wall from going up? Well, Kennedy had 3 reasons for not intervening in Berlin. He realized that putting up a wall in Berlin, Khrushchev was not making preparations to take all of Berlin. And that was their fear, that he was going to make an attempt to take over the entire city. Another reason why is he really did believe that the Berlin Wall would diffuse the crisis between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. He wouldn't be able to squeeze the testicles so much of the Western Hemisphere all the time if the wall was there. And frankly, the third thing he was quoted as saying when he asked why he didn't intervene in Berlin, he said, quote, "A wall is much better than a war." And so that was his feeling. Well, you all know that he, in June of 1963, visited West Berlin. A vast cheering crowd gathered to see him at the City Hall. And in West Berlin, President Kennedy gave a very moving and emotional speech to the people of West Berlin, basically telling them, this is my favorite quote, he says, "Freedom has many difficulties and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put up a wall to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us." I think that was the best quote. And of course you have the controversy over his speech about a jelly donut and all that, and I'm not even going to get into that. But the speech in Berlin made Kennedy very popular with the people of that non-communist city, been well documented in history. The Berlin Wall stood for nearly 30 years as a menacing symbol of the Cold War division between East and West, and it was finally removed on November 8th of 1989. And so that was kind of a big deal. But anyway, there's some things that people ask me, you know, I think if John Kennedy would have lived, there's 2 things he really would have liked to have seen. He'd like seeing the demolition of the Berlin Wall and man landing on the moon.